Hi everyone, my name is Dre. I am the host and founder of the Giga Network, which is an online community where health IT professionals can share their ideas, discuss experience, and collaborate with one another on everything related to healthcare IT. On this YouTube channel, I take some of the conversations that we're having inside the network and summarize the details for you on a weekly video. So this week, what I'd actually like to talk about is pilot projects. Pilot projects are something that we tend to utilize quite frequently in a healthcare IT space, and that's because the general concept of fail early, fail fast, fail often isn't really one that we wholeheartedly embrace for obvious reasons. We are more likely to take a cautious approach and to try to implement things that we are fairly confident are going to work and that we know are actually going to have or have a high suspicion that they're going to have the outcomes that we're looking for. So in order to do that in a lot of instances, we need some more information, or we need to understand better whether the particular initiative or whether the change is going to have the impact that we want. And to do that, instead of rolling it out on a large scale, we try it in a pilot area to see what happens. So the use of pilot projects has been around really forever. But the reason that I want to talk about it today is we sometimes have pilot projects in our healthcare IT spaces that tend to go awry. So when I say awry, I mean that their scope becomes quite unclear. They seem to sort of morph into different things over time. I've seen pilots that tend to run for an enormous length of time. I was quite shocked in a former role that I had when I received a request to expand a pilot to a second group of people. And when I asked for information on the pilot, it had been going on for a little more than 4 years, but didn't have any metrics on its outcomes. They can actually sort of find lives of their own. And I want to talk about what the 3 key elements need to be before a pilot is started to make sure that that pilot has the best chance of being successful for its actual purpose. So before we jump into the 3 key elements, I want to chat a little bit about what a pilot itself is supposed to be. So a pilot is supposed to be a smaller scale version that is short term and meant to determine the feasibility of doing something on a larger scale. So it is not meant to be something that you try just for fun, just to see what's going to happen, and then great, you move on to something else. It is actually supposed to be rolled out with the intention of discovering something about the feasibility to see if the outcomes that you're going to get are going to generate the ROI you need to do this on a grander scale. You may be piloting something to see if there's going to be unforeseen problems. You may be trying to test out what sort of costs are going to be involved, what challenges you're going to see. But in the end, the purpose of a pilot is actually to determine in a short period of time with controlled parameters if the larger initiative that you're thinking about is going to be feasible or not. So it is a trial of sorts, not unlike the concepts behind clinical trials. So you're going to test something. If it works out, you're going to expand it. If it doesn't, then you need to stop and either make adjustments or move on with something different. The first element you need to have a successful pilot is a purpose. So you have to understand what the problem that you're trying to overcome actually is. So in order to determine if the pilot project is successful in achieving the goal, you have to understand what the purpose is behind it. So what are you trying to do? What is the point of the pilot? Where's your start point and what is your end goal so that you can see whether it's going to address it or not. If you don't have a purpose and there's not a distinct problem that you're trying to solve, chances are pretty high the pilot isn't going to garner the results that you want. It doesn't mean that it's not going to be something that's liked and utilized by everybody. It just means that your pilot isn't going to provide the detail that you need to determine the feasibility for a large-scale rollout. So you do need to understand exactly what it is we're trying to solve when we roll out this pilot so that we can figure out whether we're solving it. The second thing that you need to have with a pilot from the beginning, before you roll it out and before you implement it, is you need to understand what the scope is. And the scope of the pilot should be directly related to the question that you're trying to ask for feasibility. So if you're trying to understand feasibility in terms of cost, then the pilot needs to give you as much information as you need to be able to extrapolate cost. If it is trying to fix a very specific problem for workflow, then you need to have a scope that's going to address the workflow. If the workflow occurs in all areas within the hospital, determining large-scale feasibility by only rolling it out to a very, very specific group of surgeons in a particular department may not help. So it may not get you where you want to go. So you want to look at the scope and make sure that the scope of the pilot is actually going to be able to answer the questions that you have for the long-term feasibility in the time frame that you need. And the third thing that you need before you start a pilot is you need to have metrics. When I mentioned that you need to understand what the purpose is and you need to understand what you're trying to address, you also need to understand how are you going to measure whether or not it was addressed, and what data points are you going to gather in this pilot in order to understand if you are going to have feasibility on a larger scale. So if you're trying to determine feasibility from a timeline perspective, from a functionality perspective, from ROI, any of those things, then you need to make sure that you get the metrics out of your pilot that you can extrapolate into that larger initiative. So if you're not gathering metrics that you've set at the very beginning, then you're going to get to the end of the pilot, or what may be the end of the pilot, and you're not going to have the information you need to actually prepare yourselves for the larger initiative, and it's going to be an uphill battle trying to convince everyone that you need to do it. So like with most projects, setting your metrics or defining what it is you're going to measure before you get started allows you to start with a baseline and work from there. If you don't have metrics for the baseline, you can gather those as step one of the pilot. That's totally fine. But you need to understand throughout the pilot, from the start to the finish, what data it is that you're trying to gather and what metrics are you actually going to look at to understand whether the pilot was a success or not. So pilot projects, again, absolutely a great thing that you can roll out in an environment. They can certainly help you determine if something is feasible on a larger scale or if something needs to be tweaked or has an unanticipated impact. But starting out a pilot without defining these three key elements might lead you to frustration and may actually be more costly for the organization in the end, both from an adoption perspective, from a cost perspective, and from a general IT effort perspective. So I hope this was helpful. If you're thinking about a pilot project, don't forget those three things need to be in place every single time. And if you like what you see today, hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you next week.